Myth of mental illness. Bodily illness is to mental illness as literal meaning is to metaphorical meaning. We may be dissatisfied with television for two quite different reasons: because our set does not work, or because we dislike the program we are receiving. Similarly, we may be dissatisfied with ourselves for two quite different reasons: because our body does not work, bodily illness, or because we dislike our conduct, mental illness. We would be fools if we tried to get rid of beer commercials on television by having TV repairmen work on our sets. We are even more foolish when we try to get rid of phobias, obsessions, and delusions by having psychiatrists work on our brains with drugs or electricity. The bat flies through the air and looks like a bird, but is not a bird. The whale swims in water and looks like a fish, but is not a fish. The koala looks like a bear and is even called a bear, koala bear, but is not a bear. Mental illnesses may look like diseases and are called diseases but are not diseases. Cancer and diabetes are literal diseases. No one in his right mind would claim they are not bodily diseases and ignore their somatic basis in the material structure of the human body. Lovesickness and homesickness are metaphorical diseases. No one in his right mind would claim they are brain diseases and look for their somatic basis in the chemistry of nerve cells. In which class do mental illnesses belong? Are they literal or metaphorical illnesses? It seems remarkable that simply because they are called mental illnesses, or more specifically, schizophrenia or bipolar illness, psychiatrists are certain that these are brain diseases and look for their somatic basis in the chemistry of nerve cells. You are a psychiatrist. It's springtime. A young man comes to you complaining of boredom, fatigue, and lethargy. You diagnose spring fever and prescribe a drug, amphetamine. Soon the patient reports that he feels better and behaves better, whatever that means. You conclude that spring fever is a disease. Doesn't the patient's response to the treatment prove it? You are a psychiatrist. A mother brings her son, in the springtime of his life, to you, complaining that he has dropped out of college and shows little interest in himself or his surroundings. You diagnose schizophrenia and prescribe a drug, Thorazine. Soon the mother reports that the patient feels better and behaves better, whatever that means. You conclude that schizophrenia is a disease. Doesn't the patient's response to the treatment prove it? Mental illness is a neurochemical imbalance, QED. If there is a logical class comprising items properly called diseases, then there must also be a class comprising items properly called non-diseases. Moreover, because human beings are fallible, diseases must sometimes mistakenly be identified as non-diseases and vice versa. Physicians call the first mistake missing an organic diagnosis, and the second making a false diagnosis of a bodily disease the patient does not have. Finally, because human behavior is goal-directed, non-diseases may sometimes be called diseases. This may come about as a result of 1. The metaphoric displacement of meaning, characteristic of ordinary language, as in the term lovesickness. Or 2. The strategic use of metaphor, as when a writer asserts that the white race is the cancer of mankind. Or 3. The conventional use of literalized metaphor, as when deviant behavior is called mental illness. Mental illness is a metaphor. For example, calling a pretended paralysis hysteria because it looks like a real paralysis due to bodily illness is an instance of mental illness as a phenomenal metaphor. Calling a murderer psychotic to justify acquitting him as insane is an instance of mental illness as a strategic metaphor. When physicians restore the life of a person whose heart has stopped, they prove that it is possible to revive a moribund person, not that it is possible to resurrect the dead. Similarly, were psychiatrists to discover that psychiatric patients suffer from neurological diseases, they would prove that mental patients have brain diseases, not that they have mental diseases. We think that identifying a person as mentally ill is like identifying him as hypertensive, when in fact, it is more like identifying him as ugly. Although there may be widespread agreement among members of a particular group or society with such a judgment, there is, and this is crucial, nothing objective or objectifiable about it, comparable, say, to a blood pressure measurement. The patient with bodily illness, experiencing suffering, is driven to see a physician by pain, The patient with mental illness, making others suffer, is driven to see a psychiatrist by the police. The difference between bodily illness and mental illness is like the difference between the ways the word driven is used in these two sentences. Looking for the organic etiology of mental illness is like looking for the caloric content of food for thought. Trying to cure mental illness with brain surgery, electricity passed through the head, toxic chemicals, or any of the myriad other medically rationalized interventions is about as sensible and effective as trying to keep warm by chopping down and burning the family tree in the fireplace. When we say that someone has no guts, we mean that he is a coward. We would consider it absurd to treat him with an intestinal transplant. When we say that someone has a nervous breakdown, we again mean that he is something like a coward, that he does not accept responsibility for the consequences of his ill-chosen or unlucky actions. But in this case, we consider it eminently reasonable to treat him with hospitalization and drugs. Literal diseases, such as malaria or melanoma, deprive the patient of life without the additional help of human agency. That is, pathogenic microorganisms or tumor cells are the agents of death. Metaphorical diseases, such as schizophrenia or manic depression, deprive the patient of liberty and life only with the additional help of human agency. That is, the patient himself or another person are the agents of detention or death. Literalization of the metaphor of mental illness, courtesy of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. A chemical that can be injected into the body and scanned with X-rays for diagnosis of mental disease has been invented by two Georgetown University professors. Patent 4,760,225, granted this week, is assigned to the university. Schizophrenia and manic depression are among the ailments that can be detected with the method. Indeed, brain diseases can, in principle always, in practice sometimes, be diagnosed by appropriate chemical and physical methods. But mental diseases? If a person does not believe in God or heaven, it would be stupid for him to assert that prayer is ineffective for facilitating the trip to heaven. Similarly, if a person does not believe in mental illness or psychiatric treatment, it would be stupid for him to assert that antipsychotic drugs are ineffective for treating mental illness. Indeed, arguments of this type are counterproductive, each tacitly accepting a premise the speaker rejects, the reality of God and heaven in one case, of mental illness and psychiatric treatment in the other. 30 years ago, I suggested that there is and can be no such thing as mental illness. Since then, with increasing frequency, psychiatrists have announced that this or that form of human behavior, for example homosexuality, is not a mental illness. Such claims attract much popular attention, perhaps because they simultaneously assert and deny the validity of the concept of mental illness. By asserting that X is not a mental illness, they imply that although X is not, Y and Z are. As formerly people wanted both to believe and disbelieve in the existence of witches, so now they want both to believe and disbelieve in the existence of mental illness. No sooner had my suggestion that mental illness is not a disease gained a measure of acceptance than new suggestions were advanced as to what it is. Thus, some psychiatrists maintain that mental illness is a form of brain disease, others that it is a form of behavior to which individuals are driven by unbearably painful life experiences, still others that it is a form of irrational or irresponsible behavior, and so on. Such attempts to rescue the term mental illness are doomed to failure because they ignore the fact that emotionally charged terms have lives of their own and are not subject to fashionable enthusiasms for plastic reconstruction. My suggestion that mental illness is not a disease was immediately and instinctively viewed as an attempt to redistribute the wealth inherent in madness, as if I were proposing taking it away from psychiatrists and giving it to psychologists. I intended nothing of the sort. Thinking or speaking of so-called mental illnesses as problems in living or as personal problems does not imply that these phenomena are the property of psychologists. Indeed, I have made it clear from the beginning of my work that the issue of control or ownership, of conduct healthy or sick, sane or insane, is an integral part of the problem of so-called mental illness, that in order to come to grips with this problem, we must decide whether we value freedom more than health or vice versa. And that, because I value freedom more highly than health, I advocate returning illness and mental illness to their rightful owners, the patients and mental patients. One of the arguments against my claim that there is no mental illness has hardened into a line that seems to convince people that I must be wrong. It goes like this: we believe in the medical approach to mental illness. There are others, and they may or may not mention me by name, who prefer the social approach. But they are wrong, because... And then they cite studies about the genetic determinants of schizophrenia or the effectiveness of drugs for controlling it. I am often confronted with this argument, sometimes by reporters or others from the news media, and have concluded that it is founded on so successful a distortion of my position that it is virtually impossible to counter it. For if a well-meaning questioner does not see the point on which this riddle turns, no amount of fresh explanation about the mythology of mental illness is likely to make him see it. Still, I try to answer it along this line. Let us go back 400 years. Then people believed in witches, and the official explanation of witchcraft was theological. Now, suppose someone came along and said, "There are no witches. Witch is merely a name we often attach to poor and helpless people, usually women." Would it be proper to call this person's position on witches a social approach to witchcraft as against the official theological approach to it? Of course not. What this person offers is not a sociological approach to witches, but a moral and philosophical criticism of the people who call other people witches. Since everyone now knows that there are no witches, this explanation satisfies everyone about witchcraft. And since everyone now knows that there are mental diseases, this explanation satisfies no one about psychiatry. Mental illness is a myth whose function is to disguise and thus render more palatable the bitter pill of moral conflicts in human relations. In asserting that there is no such thing as mental illness, I do not deny that people have problems coping with life and each other. My critics say that I deny the reality of mental illness and cannot understand why I do not consider this an acceptable summary of my view. Would they consider it an acceptable summary of the conventional psychiatrist's view to assert that he adheres to the delusion that mental illness is like any other illness? A person planning to become an exorcist could not be expected to show much interest in the proposition that demonic possession is a myth. Faced with the possibility of the non-existence of possession, he would feel compelled to dismiss either the idea that possession is a myth or the idea of becoming an exorcist. Similar considerations obtain for the person expecting to profit from consulting an exorcist. How can one be exorcised of non-existent demons? Mutatis mutandis, a person planning to become a psychiatrist cannot be expected to show much interest in the proposition that mental illness is a myth. Faced with the possibility of the non-existence of mental illness, he would feel compelled to dismiss either the idea that mental illness is a myth or the idea of becoming a psychiatrist. Similar considerations obtain for the person expecting to profit from consulting a psychiatrist. How can one be cured of a non-existent mental illness? The moral: although many people may feel in their hearts that there is no mental illness, few believe in their heads that they can afford to act as if that were true. When everybody is convinced that something has a very high value, whether it be hunting witches in the 16th century, investing in tulip bulbs in the 17th century, or insisting that certain human desires or deeds are diseases in the 20th century, there is no point in trying to get people to change their minds. But one does not have to go along. It is possible to resist the herd instinct, think for oneself, and not get hurt, as the bubbles, relentlessly replenished with hot air, keep bursting. For the past 25 years, one psychiatrist after another has dismissed my books, asserting that I repeat my one good idea, namely that mental illness is a myth. But if that is such a good idea, why don't psychiatrists accept it as valid? Hearing me say that I don't believe in mental illness, people invariably ask, how then can you be a professor of psychiatry? My answer: the same way that a person who does not believe in God can be a professor of religion. Such a person studies the history of various religions and the behavior of persons who believe in them, teaches about diverse religions and their particular claims and rules, and writes about his own reflections on all this. That is what I do with mental illness. Having listened to or read my criticism of psychiatry, people often ask, well, what do you suggest we do with the mental patients? I offer a two-pronged answer. Suppose that a person living in Western Europe in the 16th century who believed that there were no witches and opposed burning them at the stake had been asked, well, what do you suggest we do with the witches? Obviously, he would have had to answer nothing. The same goes for the question about mental illness. My point is that an institution, considered to be essential for the integrity of society, cannot simply be removed and replaced with something else. The only way to bring about such radical social change is by means of violent revolution, a method I reject both because it is violent and because it is counterproductive. Accordingly, I believe I ought to confine my efforts to speaking and writing. I can also offer a more practical answer, as follows. Insofar as the persons we call mental patients are, or may be viewed, as losers, we should do two quite different things for or to them, depending on what kinds of losers they are. The sore losers, that is those who, in their anger and frustration, deprive others of their lives, liberty, or property, should be punished with appropriate criminal penalties. The serene losers, that is those who, despite their loss, respect the rights and dignity of others, should be rewarded with appropriate consolation prizes. I might add that in such a hypothetical society, in which psychiatry and the state would be radically separated, it would behoove the non-losers to accept the presence and suffering, if any, of the losers, without harming them in the name of helping them.